Hi guys. Sometimes when we are applying materials to objects, we cannot achieve what we're looking for by simply creating the materials inside the program. In those cases, we resort to importing what we call maps, and that is images that we can wrap around an object in the 3D environment that will serve as part of the material that we are creating. They usually provide texture to our materials. So for example, in this case, I have a simple box, just a cube that I created in Maya, and I want to apply a map to this. Now, in order for the map to wrap around the object needs to have something called UV coordinates applied to the object. Primitive objects such as boxes, spheres, and cylinders will have UV mapping already applied to them by default. The moment that you create complicated geometry by extrusions or by beveling or other changes that you have applied to your models will automatically make those UV maps that were standard useless in terms of how you can map images on top of your objects. So in those cases, we need to reconstruct the UV mapping to fit our needs. In this case, I'm going to show you the basic standard form of mapping an image onto an object. So in this case, like I said, I have a standard primitive cube. And in order for me to see what the UV mapping for this object looks like by default, I need to go to the UV drop-down menu at the top. And under UV, I go to UV Editor. This will open up this window here that is my UV Editor and the UV Toolkit. Let me lodge that on the side here so I have those two as one single window. And let's take a look at what we have here. The object that I have selected is that box, and then you see a representation of each one of the sides of this box, which is 6 sides, into the outline on this side. Now, if I go ahead and select these areas here, if I right click and go to something called UV Shelf, when I go over it, you'll notice that the whole item gets highlighted. That means, and it also gets highlighted over here in my viewport. That means that that entire area is one single shell, meaning it is one single way of wrapping the image based on UV coordinates on top of that object. Remember in class I mentioned that UVs are parallel to the way we talk about X and Y when we're talking about flat 2D images. As a matter of fact, as a reminder, every map that you create in, say, Photoshop or any raster-based program is only going to be two-dimensional. So in order for it to wrap around into a three-dimensional volumetric object, you need to have a way of creating coordinates of how that map is going to go around that object. That's what UV stands for. So we don't call them XY because obviously it would create confusion because we don't necessarily have to wrap UVs around X and Y. You could wrap them around Y and Z and so on. But the idea is basically that you have a two-dimensional way of wrapping an object, a three-dimensional way of wrapping an object that is 2D onto that volumetric object, onto that volumetric model that you are creating. So now that thing that highlights is what we call the UV shell, and that wraps around the complete object. Each one of these rectangles represents one of the sides of the object. So right now, because this is a very simple cube, each one basically represents a side. Now I can go ahead and right click on this, and instead of going to UV shelf, I can actually change either edges, vertices, faces, or UVs. So basically it's a combination of both working with components or the components for UV mapping, which are UV shell and UV. UVs and vertices are parallel to one another, meaning everywhere that I have a vertex, by default, I should have a UV when we're talking about a simple object. So if I were to go to UVs, you'll notice that as I roll over each one of the points, they get highlighted, and those are the vertices. And you'll notice also that as I roll over, take a look at this one over here, this corner. If I roll over this corner here, that point represents that point right there. And that is the point of mapping of whatever I'm applying to this object. So let's go ahead and apply a material to this so we can make use of this standard UV mapping. So let me move this to the side really quick. And I'm going to go ahead and right click on this, go to object mode, and I'm going to apply a simple material. I'm going to apply a blend material to this. So the blend material has been applied, and I'm going to call this box mat for box material. And notice that under my attributes, as we have worked before with the attributes to create materials in Maya, I have the option for mapping. Those little the little checker box that you see to the right of each one of the channels, it's a way of connecting a different material or map onto that particular channel of information. So I want to replace the color channel of information with an image. To do so, I need to click on the checker box. It opens up the it opens up the create render node, which is basically an extension, almost like creating a submaterial to that channel, specifically to that channel. And then from the options, I can either choose to add another one of the materials that exist, or I can choose from the mapping options, which include file or PSD files or any of the pre-existing maps. So in this case, I want to choose file. I'm going to choose file, and notice that basically the material changes color, and it opens up a node for me that allows me to connect to a material, to an image from the outside. For that, I need to click on the little folder right here under image name. So if I, by accident, click off elsewhere, for example, let's say I click on the gray area, do not fret, just go ahead and click on the object again, go to your material, click on where the checker box was. Now you see a little arrow pointing inward into the material. So if you click on that, you now have access to your file node. And with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and click on the little folder, which opens up this window. And in that window, I can go ahead and scroll to find the material that I need to use. In this case, it would be Woodbox right here. It's a JPEG. So you'll notice that this was set up in Photoshop to match a similar setup for my UVs in my UV editor window. So let me click open. And when I do that, basically you see that the object gets wrapped into that, wrapped by that image. Now, some of you might not see this. In order to see this on the viewport, you need to make sure that you have under shading in the viewport, you have hardware texturing activated. So make sure that that's activated. Once you activate that, if you have it off like this, go ahead and turn it on so you can see it. Now, this, as you can see, is mapping the object, but it's not really mapping it properly. And the reason for that is because the UVs don't automatically match. The program doesn't know what you're about to map onto this object. It simply gives you the coordinates through which you can map it. So let me bring back the UV editor window that I have moved to the side. Once again, if you don't have it open, go to UV editor. Now that opens up this window, and usually it creates this window and this UV toolkit as separate windows. I like to lodge them together for ease of use. So with that done, let me go ahead and place that here, and you'll notice that my map is basically mapping to that one quadrant, from 0 here to 1, and from 0 to 1. That is how this is being mapped onto that object. Now, this first quadrant by default is the quadrant in which your maps will be placed, meaning Maya will recognize that first quadrant as the quadrant for mapping. Other software packages allow you to have multi-tile mapping, but not Maya. Maya only allows you to have that first tile. Everything else past that point will become repetitive. With that in mind, everything that you're going to map within this area. And remember, the coordinates are 0 to 1 and 0 to 1. So as long as your maps are 1 to 1 in size, you should be okay to map anything within this area. With that done, let me go ahead and zoom in, and I'm going to zoom in by using my middle mouse button roll. So basically it's the same thing as with a viewport. The only thing you cannot do here is orbit, but you can pan if you need to pan left and right, or you can use your mouse to truck in or truck out. Now with that, what I want to do is I want to match, let me move my box here so we can see what's happening as I do what I'm about to do. I am going to go ahead and right click here and go to UV. So when I get that, I get the little UV points. Let me go ahead and drag a selection across them. And I'm going to switch my tool to the W tool, which is the move tool. I'm going to move this up to match the artwork. As you can see, I can go ahead and move around the UVs, and you'll notice that the artwork in my box over here is aligning properly to the way the geometry is according to the artwork. Now I can go ahead and drag one across all these, move that to the left a little bit, and then this column right here to the right. And you'll notice now that my UV mapping matches properly the geometry, matches now the map. And so it looks a lot better, right? Let's actually move this one up here so that that matches that point. And then I'm going to do the same thing to this one. And now my box looks fairly good. You have evenly distributed mapping across the geometry. So at this point, I can go ahead and close this window and focus on what I'm looking at. Let me right click on it and go to object mode, and I will orbit around so you can see what this looks like. So that takes care of the mapping, and that is just fairly straightforward mapping of an object of an image onto an object. Now, if I were to render this, let's say, for example, in Arnold and whatnot, then I would have to make sure that the material doesn't get too shiny so that I can actually grab some of that information. So if, let's say, for example, I go to Arnold, get a sky dome light, and if I were to render this right now under Arnold, you will probably notice that the thing is gonna look really, really washed out. And that is because the blend material is really shiny in Arnold. So when I have that, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and reduce the settings on my material. So let me go select the box and start moving around to reduce, for example, the reflectivity of the object so that I can start bringing back some of the color. Maybe I want to reduce the specular a little bit so that that brings up the material again. And, with that, basically, I'm reducing the shininess of the object so that I actually can see my material appropriately. You can also go to, for example, switch from blend to a standard surface material. Switch your material to that, and you'll notice that you lose the mapping. So this is an opportunity again. You can go back to your map. Over here, you would have to change the name again. Sorry, you would have to go to the material and change the name of the material. But over here under standard surface, you would go to the base color. That's what you want to change. Go to the map, bring back that material. Same process. Click on the folder, look for your material, and in this case it's woodbox.jpg. But now, since you had created the UVs already and you had set up your UVs, when you select the material, when you select the object, let's click on it, you'll notice that even though I changed the material, the UVs remained. So now I have, these will not change based on the object that I'm selecting. Meaning once you create the UV maps, they'll live unless you physically remove the UVs. They will live with your object, which is great because now you can start playing around with materials and they will give you different results depending on the types of materials that you're choosing. So with the standard surface, I can go back in and say, for example, reduce my specular so I don't want it to be as shiny, and maybe reduce the weight of this completely so that it looks exactly like the map. And so you see that the quality of the map, the actual image, is being recuperated inside the Arnold renderer and retains the quality of the file that I brought in from Photoshop.